The room was still. Before the storm, Senate chambers always carry a certain weight, but that morning the air was different, heavier. Denser light spilled down from recessed fixtures above, harsh in its clarity, washing out the deep mahogany desks until the wood looked almost pale. Reporters shifted in their seats, laptops, open pens poised, waiting for words that hadn't yet been spoken. Cameras were already fixed, their lenses like unblinking eyes capturing every movement, before meaning had even begun to form. If you listened closely, you could hear the small sounds of preparation, the soft shuffle of papers, the creak of leather chairs, the clearing of throats. Even those familiar noises seemed sharper, as if magnified by the anticipation that pressed down on everyone present. A low murmur traveled across the gallery. Quickly silenced by the gavel's hollow strike against wood, the flag stood tall at the front, its fabric heavy and still, unmoved by the air-conditioning draft that whispered across the room. It seemed to watch as much as it symbolized, as if aware it was about to become the silent witness to a confrontation no one would soon forget. Then the first door opened. Kamala Harris stepped through with the calm steadiness that defined her public presence. Her heels clicked against the stone floor, a rhythm that announced not just her arrival, but her intent. She carried a folder under her arm, pen clipped neatly to the side. Though it was her posture, upright, shoulders squared, that told the room, she came ready. There was no rush in her step, no glance wasted. Each movement was controlled, as though she had rehearsed not only her questions but the very cadence of her walk. Minutes later, Senator John Kennedy entered. His energy shifted the atmosphere immediately, where Harris moved with precise restraint. Kennedy brought an almost casual presence, a slow gait, glasses adjusted with an absent touch, a faint growl. In tugging at his lips, he had the air of someone who had seen 100 hearings like this before, and wasn't inclined to treat it with undue reverence. His Louisiana drawl wasn't yet audible, but somehow you could already hear it in the way he carried himself side by side. Though not yet speaking, the contrast between them was striking. Harris sharp. Lines and focus radiated an intensity that demanded attention. Kennedy, easy in his skin, seemed intent on disarming through charm, or at least the appearance of it. Both, however, carried with them the quiet awareness that this was no routine session. The staffers settled into their places, eyes darting between laptops and the principals at the front. The audience hushed further, sensing something unspoken outside. The city pulsed with its usual noise, horns blaring in traffic, pedestrians weaving through the capitals, streets chatter, spilling from nearby coffee shops. But here inside these walls, time narrowed to this room, this moment, and within, that narrowing and unasked question floated in the silence. What happens when two voices, each powerful in their own right, collide over not just policy, but principle? The gavel struck again, sharper. This time, the session was officially in motion. Chairs adjusted, microphones clicked on. Kamala Harris leaned forward slightly, pen now in her hand. John Kennedy tilted back in his chair, expression, unreadable eyes settling on her with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. The quiet before the storm was ending, and everyone present knew, though no one would admit it out loud, that this was about to be more than a debate over legislation. It was about respect, identity, and the deep divide of how Americans see one another. To understand the weight of that morning, you had to understand the people at its center. Kamala Harris was not new to confrontation. Her career had been shaped by it long before her name was printed across national headlines. Before the campaign stages and the bright lights of primetime interviews, she had been in courtrooms, smaller rooms with smaller audiences, but with stakes just as high as a prosecutor. She had stood before juries facing defendants who did not want to be there, and defense attorneys determined to outmaneuver her. She learned early that authority meant little without precision, and that sharpness of mind had to be paired with clarity of voice. Those courtroom days gave her a style she never abandoned. Every question she asked was tight, deliberate and structured to corner the answer. Some found it electrifying, the way she could narrow her focus until her subject seemed to squirm under the weight of her gaze. Others found it unsettling, even abrasive, accusing her of being less a public servant and more an interrogator. Harris never seemed to mind the criticism. She knew her style was not for everyone. She also knew she had built a career on holding people accountable, and accountability rarely came wrapped in comfort. What defined her, though, was not just sharpness. It was the combination of history and expectation. As one of the most visible women of color in American politics, Harris carried with her the weight of representation, the knowledge that every exchange, every headline, was filtered not just through her own choices, but through what she symbolized to millions. To some, she was hope embodied proof that power could look different, sound different, and push against long-standing barriers to others. She was a threat to the established order, a reminder of change they resisted. She knew. Both perceptions trailed her, wherever she went, and she carried them, unflinching, into that chamber. John Kennedy's path had been different, but no less defined by confrontation. Born and raised in Louisiana, educated in both the South and at elite universities, Kennedy embodied a blend of worlds that shaped his voice and his politics. He often leaned on the cadence of small-town wisdom, peppering his remarks with metaphors that sounded like they were borrowed from front porches and fishing boats. He was the kind of politician who could look straight into a camera and say something that sounded simple, even humorous, while underneath the words cut with calculated precision to his supporters. This was his gift, the ability to strip down Washington jargon into plain talk, to remind people back home that their voices still mattered in a city that too often drowned them out. To his critics, it was performance, a mask of folksiness, covering partisanship as sharp as any other senator's. But Kennedy's presence was not built on performance alone. He carried the deep conviction, true or not, that he spoke for people who felt forgotten, in an era where politics seemed increasingly divided between the polished and the populist. Kennedy wore the latter badge proudly. He did not mind ruffling feathers, did not flinch from being called blunt. In fact, he seemed to relish it when Harris and Kennedy sat across from each other. Then it was not just two politicians preparing for an exchange. It was two philosophies colliding. Harris represented the precision of accountability, the insistence that questions deserved answers and that power must be pressed until it revealed its truth. Kennedy represented the resistance to being cornered, the belief that authority did not grant anyone the right to dictate tone or submission. One carried the sharpened edge of the prosecutor, the other, the stubborn defiance of the small-town lawyer who refused to be out-talked, and the stakes stretched far beyond the chamber. For Harris, the exchange was not just about the immediate policy on the table. It was about proving that persistence could pierce through obfuscation, that the clarity of truth was worth pressing for. Even when it made people uncomfortable. For Kennedy, the stakes were equally high, not yielding to what he might frame as overreach, not allowing someone to dictate the terms of respect, not giving ground. When the cameras were watching, both knew their supporters were watching too. For some, Harris embodied the future, diverse, unrelenting, a voice unwilling to bend to the comfort of the old guard. For others, Kennedy was the defense rooted in tradition, skeptical of what they saw as political theater, unwilling to bow to what they viewed as elitism. Neither senator had to say any of that aloud. It hung in the room between them, unsaid but heavy, and it was this weight of history, of symbolism, of representation, of stubbornness that made their clash inevitable, because this was never just about a question or an answer. It was about what each figure represented in a country stretched thin between two visions of itself. Kamala Harris adjusted her pen, her fingers steady. John Kennedy leaned back slightly, arms folded, his eyes still fixed on her. In their silence, the room could already sense it. These were not two people about to politely disagree. They were about to test the limits of how much confrontation a single chamber and a single nation could hold. At first, the exchange carried the shape of routine. Harris adjusted her microphone, cleared her throat softly, and leaned forward in that practiced way that signaled she was ready to begin. Kennedy shifted in his chair, casual but alert, his fingers laced together on the desk. Her voice broke the quiet with precision. Senator Kennedy, I want to begin with a simple question. The room stilled. It wasn't only the words "questions begin hearings every day," but the weight in her tone. Harris's words carried no wasted syllables. She spoke cleanly, pointedly, the way a lawyer does when she already knows where the line of questioning will go. Kennedy listened with his head tilted slightly, almost amused, his expression giving away nothing but curiosity. When she finished, he leaned into the microphone, the rhythm of Louisiana coloring his response. Well now, Madam Vice President, that's a fine way to start, but if you'll allow me, I think you've asked the wrong question. A ripple of sound stirred in the gallery, a stifled cough, the rustle of note-taking. Harris's lips pressed into a line. She didn't flinch, but her pen tapped once against the folder. No, Senator. It's the right question. You just don't want to answer it. The words landed with quiet force. Kennedy smiled faintly. The kind of smile that says, I hear you, but I'm not going to bend. He spoke slowly, drawing out his syllables like a fisherman, letting lines slip into the water. Mom, with all due respect, I've been asked a lot of questions in this chamber. Some deserve an answer. Some are just meant to trap a man. That was the opening volley. Harris leaned closer, her voice cooling further, each word, clipped, clean, a trap senator would imply. You've already decided not to be honest. It was no longer routine. The exchange rolled forward, question and answer, circling each other like sparring partners in a ring. Harris pressed. Kennedy parried. She asked for specifics, numbers, commitments. He answered with broad strokes. Anecdotes, flourishes that skirted the edges, but never landed where she aimed. At one point she asked again, sharper, Senator, are you refusing to acknowledge the evidence placed in front of you? Kennedy's reply came with that disarming half grin. I'm just refusing to let you put war in my mouth. You're mighty good at asking questions, but not every answer fits the script. You want. The staffers in the back glanced up from their notes. Reporters' fingers clattered faster against keyboards. The cameras zoomed tighter. Everyone could sense the subtle shift. The transformation of a hearing into a moment. Harris. Patience thinned. She was still composed, still steady. But the rhythm of her questioning came faster now. One after the other, each one closing the space for Kennedy to maneuver. Her voice didn't rise, but her intensity sharpened. Then answer plainly. Yes or no? Kennedy leaned back, chuckling softly, the sound amplified by his microphone. Mom, I've been married a long time. I've learned that a yes or no answer rarely tells the whole story. The room broke with a small wave of laughter from the gallery. Harris did not smile. Her pen tapped again once and then stilled. Senator, this isn't a marriage, it's governance. The people deserve clarity. And then came the pause, the moment where the back and forth, sharp as it already was, turned from sparring into something heavier. Kennedy's grin faded. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly, his tone dropping. You're not here to find clarity. You're here to score a point, and I won't be your prop. The air shifted. Reporters looked up. Harris froze for just half a second, a silence that carried weight when she spoke again. Her voice was even lower, but colder, firmer. Sit down, boy. It was not loud. It was not shouted, but it struck like glass shattering on marble. The room inhaled all at once and then went silent. The word hung heavy in the air. Not just boy, but the history. It carried the dismissal. It implied the challenge. It threw down. Some saw defiance in her voice, the refusal to let his evasions stand. Others heard something sharper, a wound reopened, a reversal of language that had long been used to diminish. Kennedy's head snapped slightly, his eyes widening just for an instant before narrowing. Again, he did not laugh. This time, he did not grin when he spoke. The weight of his own history pressed back against hers. Mom, he said slowly, each word deliberate. Where I come from, respect is given, not commanded, and if you think you can shame me into silence, you'll be waiting a long time. The words landed heavy, not just on Harris, but on the room itself. A low murmur swept through the gallery. Quickly silenced, reporters, hands moved furiously, staffers shifted, unsure where to look for a beat. Too long, neither senator moved. Harris, gaze locked on Kennedy's, her pen frozen midair. Kennedy leaned forward now, no longer casual, no longer disarming, his posture firm, his eyes sharp. The air between them seemed to vibrate, charged with something rawer than politics. This was no longer about a question, no longer about policy, no longer about the ordinary rhythm of a hearing. This was about pride, about history, about the fragile, combustible line between authority and defiance. And as the silence stretched, every person in the room, and later every person watching from a distance, knew they had witnessed the beginning of something that would not fade quickly. The clash had begun outside the marble walls of Washington, beyond the bright lights of the chamber. There was a man named David Ellis. David was not a politician. He wasn't a lawyer or a pundit or someone who could afford to spend his evenings debating policy over wine and candlelight. He was a high school history teacher in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A man who had spent nearly 20 years walking the same hallways, chalk dust on his sleeves, explaining to teenagers why the past mattered to their present. On the morning that Harris and Kennedy clashed, David was in his classroom, rolling the television cart out from the corner. He didn't always show hearings or debates to his students. In fact, he usually avoided them. But that day, the timing lined up with his lesson on the Reconstruction era, and he thought it might be worth letting his students see how echoes of history lived in modern politics. The kids slouched in their cheiksu, Arts half interested, half bored, until the moment unfolded, Harris leaning forward, Kennedy leaning back, the tension snapping, and then those words, "sit down." Boy, the classroom went silent. No one laughed. A few kids shifted uneasily. One girl whispered to her friend, "David didn't speak. He just stood there, remote in his hand, staring at the frozen screen, as if the words themselves were still vibrating in the air, that night after the students had gone. After the papers had been graded and the fluorescent lights shut off, David drove home in silence. His house sat at the edge of town, a modest single story with a sagging porch and a pecan tree in the yard. His wife Marcia was already inside, stirring a pot of gumbo on the stove. "You see it?" she asked when he walked in. David nodded. "Yeah, I saw." He didn't add anything. At first he sat at the kitchen table, the smell of spices filling the air, and stared at the wood grain for him. Those words carried weight heavier than politics. He had grown up in the South, born in 1974, raised by parents who had lived through the tail end of Jim Crow. His father used to tell stories, the sting of being called boy by men who thought they owned the air. You breathed the way dignity could be chipped away, not with violence, but with language, too. To David, hearing Harris use that word in that way stirred something complicated. On the one hand, he understood the context, the dismissal of Kennedy's evasions, the force of a prosecutor refusing to yield on the other. The word itself reopened a wound that never fully healed, even generations later. Later that week, David brought it up in class. He stood at the front, marker in hand, his students leaning against desks with their phones tucked into their laps. "History doesn't disappear," he said. "It hides in words. It hides in the way we talk to each other, and sometimes it shows up where you least expect it." One boy raised his hand. "But she didn't mean it like that, right? Like she wasn't trying to say it the way people used to." David paused. He tapped the marker against the whiteboard, once, twice before answering. "Intent matters, but impact ma. Tears too. You can't always separate the two." The students nodded, some slowly, some still confused. David didn't try to resolve it neatly. He knew better than to pretend that one conversation could close the gap between history and present. But he wanted them to sit with it, the discomfort, the weight, the way language could carry power across centuries. After class, one girl lingered. Her name was Tiana. She was 17, sharp-eyed, always quick to challenge him when she thought his lessons didn't connect to real life. She asked quietly, "So, what are we supposed to do with that? If even they, the ones in charge, can talk without cutting each other down, what's left for us?" David looked at her, seeing not just a student, but the face of a generation that had inherited fractures not of their making. He thought about his father's stories. He thought about the frozen silence in his classroom when those words were spoken. And then he answered, not with certainty, but with honesty. "You remember it," he said. "You carry it. You make sure it doesn't get lost in the noise, because how we speak to each other. That's where history lives." That night, David sat on,